Hey everyone, welcome back to the Youth and Politics podcast. My name is Cody.
My name is Carrera, and today we are here with
Lamin.
wow, lovely stuff.
Yeah, awesome guys.
So we're going to be talking about neo-colonialism, a very, very loaded topic,
Yeah,
but it'll be really
definitely.
interesting. Do you want to start us off by telling us a little bit about what it is?
Yeah, 100%. So I think that probably the simplest way to describe neo-colonialism is when one country, usually a developed, wealthier country, takes control of another country through indirect means. It's different to traditional colonialism in that it's not happening in a military sense. Do you know what I mean? There's not necessarily
Mm.
the deployment of troops, not necessarily the loot and plunder of resources in the same way, right? Neocolonialism, okay. Yikes.
Yes.
Neocolonialism, we can mainly see it happening from about World War II onwards. And I think that the reason for this shift is particularly coming out of World War II,
Mm.
out of the atrocities of the Nazi regime. There's a bigger consciousness about people's liberties, people's freedoms, and actually colonialism, the old-fashioned sense, is not necessarily right for the period anymore. And I think that actually going in and invading countries just smacks of Hitler's beliefs. And so that's why ultimately there was this need to change to a more covert, a lot more underhanded form of colonialism. Particularly in the world today, it's affecting Africa, it's affecting Asia, Latin America. We can mainly see it happening through economic means. However, there's also a cultural sense to it and a sense of a loss and a diminishment, I think, of the indigenous cultures of these nations. And I think that essentially what it is a change of form, not of substance. We're still seeing the same relationship here. We're still seeing the same power hierarchies, but it's in a different sense. And so if we in the world today basically believe that actually all nations are independent, and actually just because these nations now have political independence, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are economically independent. And actually that sense of autonomy really is meaningless if that's not also, I think, accompanied with the ability to decide your own fiscal policies, good governance, ethical leaders who are actually willing to stop, I think, the cycles of underdevelopment and the stunted growth that we're seeing in these nations.
Damn. Round of applause for
25.
Lamin,
Yeah, come
guys.
on. Thanks, guys.
No, that was really good. That's really good.
Yeah.
It's really interesting though, because like you said, I think like now, like controlling through military is such it's kind of old timey.
Almost,
It's very old timey, I think. And it's interesting though, because some countries still do that. Like if you look at conflict national like globally, like there is still some places that are trying to
Yeah,
like use
definitely.
military force. But like you said, it's happening so much and we don't realize, but in a more like
Covert,
yeah,
sort of
kind of
indirect
hidden,
way.
hidden,
Yeah,
It's
honestly.
really crazy. Um, so you mentioned the financial side of things.
Yes.
Would you like to delve into that a little bit?
Yeah, 100%. So I think okay, so for example, right, Karl Marx, in a lot of his writings, he's a philosopher, politician, and he essentially produced this big beast that is Marxism, that we know today, speaks a lot about how actually the economy is so important to
Mm,
society. And when you are interpreting and you're looking at society, you can't really separate the economy from it because the two are intertwined. Do you know what I mean? What is society without money,
mhm.
right? And so therefore we can find that power and where autonomy lies, where independence lies in who has money and who
mm,
doesn't have money, right? And so it's essentially these, again, more developed nations controlling these smaller nations through money. So specifically, right, if we look at France and current French imperialism, right, again, one of the big values, especially coming out of the French Revolution to the French, is liberty, independence, right? However, the colonialism and the empires really that we see in France have not stopped. And they have not changed. They haven't actually, we haven't lost them really, just because now these countries have gained independence. So specifically, right, in 1940, I want to say five. Yeah, that's right.
maybe.
In 1945, France basically introduced a currency known as the CFA franc, right? And what this was is basically a currency, it's a fiscal policy where 14 countries in Africa, use this currency, the CFA franc. And what it is it's directly tied to the euro. And what that means is that actually African countries don't get the ability to control their euro. They don't get the ability to devalue the euro. It's specifically through trade agreements as well that this sort of relationship, I guess, is maintained. So specifically, for example, some caveats in the policies when the French were working with African nations in order to get these policies started is that African nations have to donate 50%, right, of their economic reserves, as well as an additional 20% of their economic reserves to the French treasury. We can clearly see what that means, right? It's only 30% of their money that these African nations have the control over. Already, when it comes to governments being able to, maintain money, maintain the economy, we could already see that there's such a loss of autonomy there.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? A big part of it as well is economic exploitation and labor exploitation. So back to Karl Marx again. Guys, he's actually like really tied into this whole stuff. I do RS, right? Like as part of my A levels. So I'm telling you, like the revision, it's straight in there, guys.
This is your revision.
Yeah, that's what this is essentially. But yeah, so Karl Marx speaks about the labor theory of value, right? And essentially what this means is that he's saying that under capitalism and under capitalist imperialism, which is what this is really,
Notes out.
yeah, get the news out, guys. Gotta check, gotta see, I'm getting my facts right. It basically suggests that workers are being exploited because you're being paid a wage less than the wealth than the products that you are creating, right? Let me like specifically explain this in terms of like me personally, right? So obviously I'm 17, got a part-time job, right? I'm down at McDonald's hurling cheeseburgers, mate. Oh my goodness gracious me. I can't like eat them. I can't. It's the smell of the cheese, right? I'm sick of it. But I earn £8.40 an hour, right, at McDonald's. And I'm telling you, the amount of cheeseburgers, of mayo chickens that you will make in an hour is absolutely insane.
Yeah.
A cheeseburger alone is £1.79. A mayo chicken alone is £1.49, right? One time, hey, this is a true story, by the way. Someone ordered 51 mayo chickens to the restaurant.
That's crazy.
51, yeah. It's like, I think it was 75.99. That's how much it costs. Straight mayo chickens, right? Obviously, as you can imagine, I'm earning £8.40. That's the lowest rate that you can earn. The highest rate that you can earn at McDonald's is £12.21, right? So already in about the half an hour that it would take to make as many burgers as that, you can see that actually I'm only being paid about £8 while I've just created a good £70 worth of wealth, right? That £62 difference is what Marx calls surplus wealth, right? And he says that it's within this surplus wealth that exploitation lies. Because it's not equal, is it? Do you know what I mean? That's the definition of exploitation, right? And so when French companies come into African nations and they set up factories, and they have workers, they have employees. When the same thing happens in Asia, for example, in the sweatshops in Bangladesh, we're seeing that actually, like companies are exploiting these workers in order to basically gain and maximize profits and make sure that they can have control over these economies, right? If you think specifically about India, for example, it's estimated that around, hey, come on, yeah, come on, hey. Um, but yeah, when we think about India, for example, it's around one-fourth to one-fifth of India's industrial production that is foreign controlled. That might not seem like a lot, but actually, 51% of the Indian workforce is employed in agriculture, right? So already we can see that such a massive component of India's economy, India's industry, is being settled by foreign hands. Do you know what I mean? We can see how dangerous this is because there's no incentive there. As a business owner, there's not necessarily the same sense of corporate social responsibility. When the only thing standing between you and so much wealth is humans and, people with lives, that can seem really easy, I think, to trample over. In order to basically get to those profits. It's really sick learning about the labor abuses that we see happening in these countries. In Brazil, for example, it's estimated that workers at sweatshops for like Zara, Bershka, these sort of commercial stores are working 16 to 19 hours days, right? After an 8-hour shift at McDonald's, I am wiped. I'm
Cooked.
telling you,
Cooked.
I'm like, you know what I mean? So already, like,
Yeah.
it's such a human rights abuse. And so I think it shows how neocolonialism really fits into a larger framework that is capitalist imperialism. Do you know what I mean? Ultimately, the main goal driving this is money, and the reason that these countries are not able to have the freedom that I think they deserve, that in philosophy and ethical debates, we have realized that actually all of these nations deserve the right to self-governance. They deserve the right to be able to control their finances, and actually progress these countries. They're not getting that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
They're not getting that independence. And I think that a big part of that is the financial element. And the fact that these multinational corporations, which are essentially companies operating in two or more countries, are exploiting, again, labor, cheap labor that they can get from these African nations, from these Latin American nations, from these Asian nations as well, to basically, yeah, maximize profits.
It's really interesting though, because like if you think about like the Cold War, like
Yeah.
when after World War II as well, when America was trying to like help rebuild Europe, and you have all these like plans like the European. God, you know what? After my A-levels, I've actually forgotten everything.
Yeah, fair
But
enough.
there was I could be wrong. I think it was the Marshall Plan, and it was to help rebuild Europe after the Second World War. And it was just a massive thing, dollar imperialism, which is essentially kind of a similar
Yeah.
thing of like controlling these countries through their money, because obviously America's giving like billions to like Greece, for example, to
Exactly.
help them rebuild. So what Greece does has to kind of fit what America's giving them the money for. Otherwise, funding stops. That's it. Like,
Yeah.
no, you can't have
Yeah.
control over it. Like that's how they're controlling them. So it's kind of interesting to see how that's still
Yeah.
happening, because in my head the Cold War was like
Mm.
thousands of years ago, even though it wasn't. But it was actually thousands
Yeah.
of years
I
ago.
know what you
Do you know
mean.
what I mean? But
Yeah, I feel
it
like
feels
that.
Yeah.
very, very old.
It does, yeah.
I do want to pick up on something you said though, because I think
Mm.
it'd be interesting to think about. I might put you on the spot here.
No,
Sorry.
you're right.
The trade agreements that you mentioned, obviously they play such a big role.
Yeah, yeah.
What do you think would happen, hypothetically, if
Mhm.
all trade agreements just gone?
Do you know what? Hey, I think that actually, honestly, I think that these nations would be better off. A big part. So, like, for example, the politician Marcus Garvey, we study him in politics actually. He basically talks about what we need to do to stop the stunted growth that Africa is seeing. He again, like, he's speaking for Africa. Obviously, this doesn't necessarily speak for like the other places in the world where this is happening. But he specifically talks about economic self-sufficiency
Yeah.
and how it's so important to cut off things like trade agreements, to stop conditional aid, because that's a really big part of it. Um, and actually making sure that Africa as a continent can stand alone, and that actually these trade agreements aren't inhibiting so much of their natural rights to self-governance, right? We can actually see, for example, this happening in Guinea. We can see what happens when colonies essentially gain this consciousness as to how they are being exploited and actually realize, no, I don't want this for myself. Insurgency is dealt with very harshly. So in Guinea, for example, when Guinea rejected the CFA Franc agreement, and actually specifically the quote that Guinea's leader at the time said is that he would rather his people be rich in freedom than poor in slavery. Wait, poor in freedom than rich in slavery. Yeah, yeah, there we go. And I think that that to me like speaks a lot about how again this sort of Western influence I think needs to be purged from these countries in order to gain proper like
Yeah.
self-determination.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? However, the unfortunate thing that happened to that Guinean leader is that actually what the French did is that in a military coup. So, although old style colonialism, where military force is not necessarily exercised as such, like isn't really used in the same way, we can still see it is used, isn't it? And essentially, he was overthrown through a military coup. And then there were steps taken to basically destabilize Guinea as a country, all because they basically rejected the CFA franc, right? The steps that were taken. So hyperinflation was basically introduced by flooding counterfeit notes into the Guinean economy. These are the things I'm saying as like genuinely, when you are like researching this stuff, it almost feels like a conspiracy theory.
Is this real?
I'm like the beef I have with Emmanuel Macron. I'm like, this guy does not want to see me. Do you know do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so hyperinflation took place. They cut pensions for war veterans as well. Like Guinean war veterans who had fought for the French army. And so yeah, I think it shows that so much of what goes into this is brute force. And actually, when these countries are complying, honestly, part of it is fear, isn't it? Do you know what I
Mm.
mean? Because when again, you do not have necessarily a strong economic base to stand on. When you don't have a strong military,
Mm.
it's harder to, I guess, stand up
Yeah.
against these
Yeah.
threats. Do you know what I mean? And so, therefore, the where I believe everybody should be, which is where countries are interacting, and countries have relationships with each other, but these relationships don't necessarily have to have the value of power added to
Yeah.
them. Do you know what I mean? And there doesn't have to be inequalities in these relationships. I think that we can achieve a globalized multicultural world where trade agreements, because trade agreements can like really benefit
Yeah.
economies,
Yeah, no.
can't they? So actually, collaboration and cooperation is, I think, still part of the answer, still part of the solution. But I think it's about putting Africa first, in a sense. I think it's about
Mm.
putting these colonies first and really taking the time to sort of extract all of this colonial influence from the economy and make sure that actually we are standing alone in
Yeah.
a sense, as a
Yeah.
country, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What, like, for a question from me, like, what in your eyes would be a better future where this is actually like solved in your eyes?
I think that a big part of it is socialist development. So I think investing
Hmm.
in homes, investing in, like local trades, because I think that the biggest part of foreign trade agreements is that they're not actually benefiting local economies, are
Yeah.
they? When they open okay, like the little like stumble, like sweatshops, yeah. I don't have a list, guys, I think.
Mm.
That's okay.
When they open sweatshops in Bangladesh or Myanmar, that's not actually benefiting the local economies because, again, like we said, those workers are working 16 to 19-hour days. Do you know? So I think that a big part of it is socialist development and making sure that actually economies are more collectivist. I think it's about actually trying to inject money into these local economies. Like I said earlier, for example, it was 70% of France Afrique countries that 70% of their economies that they did not get access to, right? Do you know how harmful that is? I think that actually by giving these countries more independence and actually making sure that money is not constantly flowing out of the
Yeah.
country is the best way to, I think, escape this neo-colonial state.
Mhm.
Of the world.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
that's what I
That's pretty
think.
cool. It's really
Yeah.
interesting,
I've
actually.
actually learned so much.
Yeah, I feel
Yeah.
like
Like, I feel like I was just in a history lesson.
no, I love it. I miss it so much. But I think it's really interesting because you spoke about the kind of the consequences that came of
Mm.
not, like, for example, with
Yeah.
France and
Yeah.
like not accepting Frank. Like that's crazy because in my head when you said that, the first thing that came to my mind was like the fear. So like you've got
Mm.
Stalin, you've got Hitler, you've got Mao, all these powerful leaders that have all used fear as such a like massive control mechanism.
100%.
Like
And like
it's
me
kind of
personally, I
inevitable.
think this is like really key, like
Mm,
for young people to actually know, because obviously
yeah.
it's literally going to affect them
Mm.
when they're older
Definitely.
and stuff.
Yeah, I
Exactly.
completely
And
agree.
it will affect the sector that you want to work in as well, I
Yeah,
reckon.
like
So I literally made notes. Like I was making notes as you were talking. I was like, oh my God, so
Yeah.
interesting.
Love
yeah,
that, love
But
that.
yeah.
yeah, that was really interesting.
Yeah, also.
How do you think neo-colonialism and I think colonialism in general as well can be more embedded into what we study?
I
Ooh,
think
yeah.
that, that's a really good
That was-
question.
Yeah, that was
Yeah.
yeah.
I think ultimately, like for me, because it's been a big research project, essentially like preparing for this podcast, like sweating up at like 1 a.m. I'm on my laptop, like typing away, you know what I mean? I think the biggest thing for me was realizing actually how all of these different disciplines, history, economics, sociology, politics,
Mm.
philosophy, how all of these kind of fields are interlinked. And so I think that by introducing in school subjects an awareness as to how these things connect, as to how these kind of relationships
Mm.
are formed is really key. So like for example, I watched like the episode you guys did about domestic and international politics,
Mm.
and I think that something that is really important is making sure that young people are more aware of
Yeah.
international politics because I feel like the separation and distance can make it feel like, you know,
Yeah.
the government in China has nothing to do with me. Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean? When it's
Yeah.
actually realistically, it actually kind of does. I mean,
It's got a
like,
lot to do
Yeah.
with you.
Yeah.
bro, Trump's tariffs, all of this, like, oh my
Yeah.
gosh, no.
It all links. It all links
Exactly.
together.
Do you know what I mean? It all does link. And so I think that the best thing to do is to show people the links. Do you know what I mean? And show people
Mm.
how all of these things are related. Because for me, like going into it, I didn't realize how interconnected things would be as they
Yeah.
are. And so
Yeah.
I think that in order for us to like, for our children, for our youth to actually gain this like consciousness and gain this awareness and critical thinking, what we need to do is be like talking about it more in schools and analyzing the relationships more. So like for example, like Cold War history A level, learning about how prior to decolonization, it wasn't just like there was then no relationship between
Yeah.
these two
Mm.
countries anymore. Do you know what I mean? That influence is still lingering and the borders are still almost like merging in a sense. Do you know what I mean? So I think that yeah, I think that that's probably the way forward. And I definitely think that it is great to educate yourself on these
Mhm.
topics. Like me personally, as like a black person, as someone who is very proud to be like from Gambia, do you know what I
Mm.
mean? I'm proud to be an African person. It's so like enlightening and almost like saddening in a way. Do you know what I mean?
Mm.
To like
Yeah.
see how so much of your people, because you feel a connection to them, really,
Yeah.
like how so much of your people have been subjugated, have been controlled in the past,
Mm.
and actually seeing, I think it's almost like the question of what if, and like,
Yeah.
hey, imagine if like those trade agreements had never been
Yeah.
Yeah.
instated. Do you know what I mean? We would have literally, hey, if you watch like Black Panther, like Wakanda, they've got the spaceships, the like
Yeah.
everything. I'm telling you, literally, we would have
Yeah.
like unlocked time travel. I'm telling you, we would have been fine. Hey. But
Yeah.
it's like yeah, it's like cool to think about, isn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah. I do think about that a lot actually.
Yeah.
Because like I'm from India, obviously, so I think about like,
Yeah.
what would India be like if, like, for example, the partition didn't happen?
Mm.
What would it be like? There would be no beef. Like,
Yeah,
what would
in
it be
it.
like? It's so interesting to think
It's so
about.
yeah.
But no, I hear it. But yeah,
Yeah.
thank you so much for
Yeah,
coming
yeah.
on. That was
100% guys.
That's taught
very
me so much.
informative.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah,
Yeah. I
it was
Yeah.
really
mean,
great.
you know, what I can do,
Amazing.
right? Yeah.
But thank
So
you so
yeah.
much,
Yeah, 100%.
and
Thank you.
thank you for tuning in.
Yeah, that's been awesome, guys. Thank you guys so much. Yeah. Appreciate it. Bye.